Good and evil were the specific differences yielded by the thought of spirit as immediately existent. Since their antithesis has not yet been resolved and they are conceived of as the essence of thought, each of them having an independent existence of its own, man is a self lacking any essential being and is the synthetic ground of their existence and their conflict. But these universal powers just as much belong to the self, or the self is their actuality. In accordance with this moment, it therefore comes to pass that just as evil is nothing other than the self-centeredness of the natural existence of spirit, so conversely, good enters into actuality and appears as an existent self-consciousness. That which in the pure thought of spirit is in general merely hinted at as the othering of the divine being, here comes nearer to its realization for picture thinking. This realization consists for picture thinking in the self-abasement of the divine being who renounces his abstract and non-actual nature. Picture thinking takes the other aspect, evil, to be a happening alien to the divine being, to grasp it in the divine being itself as the wrath of God. This demands from picture thinking, struggling against its limitations, its supreme and most strenuous effort. An effort which, since it lacks the notion, remains fruitless. There is an awful lot going on here in paragraph 777. Quite a bit of it is continuation of what's been happening in the earlier paragraphs on the overall development of this section. You notice that there's quite a few references to picture thinking, that is Vorstellung. And there's also one that you might not catch, in part because of the translation, where it's a verbal form, right? Talking about something being conceived, and the word there is vorgestellt. So all of this is, at this point, taking place in terms of Vorstellung, picture thinking, imagination, representation is another way that we can talk about it. And you notice as we get through all of these, I won't use the word distinction, since that's actually one of the words that we're going to be talking about here, but all of these dialectical progressions that are available to the phenomenologist. Towards the end of this paragraph, we see it explicitly turning to picture thinking, and it not getting it, right? We see that this demands from picture thinking, struggling against its limitations, its supreme and most strenuous effort, an effort which, since it lacks the notion, remains fruitless. What is the notion? Well, a concept, Begriff, is another way of talking about this, and that's the way that we need to ultimately understand, make sense of what religion is really after. And what we have here is picture thinking, and this is kind of an achievement. It's not to be dismissed. It's an important step on the way, right? Struggling against its limitations. Picture thinking can even be aware to some extent, not entirely, of course, because that's the realm of the concept, but aware to some extent with its limitations, and then struggle to go past them. The trouble is that when it does so, it either uses picture thinking, just sort of taking it to a higher level, or it uses what Hegel will call elsewhere the philosophy of the understanding rather than the philosophy of the concept, or it could degenerate to a lower, earlier kind of shape of consciousness, and it's a way of accessing the world, making sense of it, making sense of itself, and thereby, go further astray. But here, Hegel is, as we've said so many times before, he's charting out the success stories of the dialectic, not where the dialectic ends because it gets into an impasse or because it finds a stable dynamic that it's going to remain in until something else comes along to supplant it. All right, so let's go back to the start of this paragraph and chart out what's going on. So we've got, from the previous paragraphs, good and evil, gut und böse, right? And these, he says, exist in an antithesis. And I've remarked previously that whenever we see that word antithesis, we do want to go back to the German, because Miller has a tendency to translate several different things by antithesis. Well, this is antithesis in the strictest sense. This is contradiction, Gegensatz, right? So it's not just mere opposition, being set, in opposition to each other, and Gegengesetz, right? It's not merely distinction or something like that. This is contradiction. And, well, why wouldn't we have absolute contradiction? We're talking about things that are, fundamentally contradictory, aren't we? Good and evil. I mean, true and false. It's hard to get more contradictory than that. And he tells us that these were the specific differences yielded by the thought of spirit as immediately existent. So, I want to hesitate on this word differences, right? Which could also be translated as distinctions, which would be a little bit closer to it. Unterschiede, right? So things that have been separated, things that have been put apart. There are differences, that's true, but distinction is a little bit closer to that. And I think one of the things that we need to get, so bestimmten, specified, particularized, specific works here. These are distinctions of thought, and thought at this point is not mere thought, right? Even if it happens to be abstract, as we're going to see in just a bit. But thought is what we're working in, and these differences exist, you could say, between good and evil. But when you think about this, good and evil were the specific differences yielded by the thought of spirit as immediately existent. Okay, so each of them is not just different from the other or distinct from the other. Each of them is also, you could say, a modality of making a distinction or distinctions. The good doesn't distinguish things in the same way that the evil does. They are different ways of distinguishing and making sense of the world and of themselves and of their opposite or, antithesis in this case, right? Going on, he says, since their antithesis has not yet been resolved, which implies what? Well, it will be resolved eventually, just not here in this paragraph, right? So since their antithesis has not been resolved and they are conceived of as the essence of thought, that conceived of, as I was saying a little bit earlier, vorgestellt, right? So they are being, better put, represented or imagined or pictured as the essence of thought, the Wesen des Denkens, right? Each of them, now here's an interesting point, each of them having an independent existence of its own. Hegel doesn't use the word existence here, Dasein, in this portion of the paragraph. He uses it plenty in the rest of the paragraph. So having an independent existence of its own, you can translate it that way. It's jeder für sich selbstständig ist, right? Each of them is independent for itself or on its own account or taken in its own terms. And this is how they are being represented by the human person, right? Well, and by the religion too. So existence, each has at least being on its own. Each is independent. This is the way that they're understood. They're not really independent, of course, but at this point it kind of seems that way to the human being. And so because of this, because their antithesis has not yet been resolved, human being, man, Mensch, is a self lacking any essential being. Where's the essential being? On the part of good and evil, right? And so a self lacking any essential being, but also, because where do good and evil exist? Who do they exist for? Human being. The human being is the synthetische. Once again, we see that term coming up. And notice, too, that we have antithesis, we have synthetic. We don't have thesis, antithesis, synthesis going on here, right? Instead, we have a more sophisticated approach to antithesis or contradiction, if you really want to be much more close to the idea. And synthesis. The human being is a synthetic ground, putting together things, bringing them into connection with each other, things that are opposed to each other. The synthetic ground, the Boden of what? Of their existence, their Dasein. Now, here we actually have Dasein, right? I remarked that these things don't actually have independent existence as such. They're independent, right? But now they are said to have a Dasein. But where's that Dasein grounded in? Human being, right? The human being is what gives them their independent being and their conflict, their Kampf. And I think this is quite interesting. Kampf. I said, there's different terminology that Hegel uses that we sometimes translate as antithesis. And, some are stronger than the other. Kampf is a stronger term than just Gegensatz, right? Kampf is actual fighting against each other. Gegensatz is, contradicting each other. So you could say we've escalated from words to fists or, to some sort of violence against each other. But this is all for the human self. Unessential self, right? What's essential are these thoughts. So he goes on and he says, these universal powers just as much belong to the self. What are the universal powers? Good and evil. These are Mächte, powers, forces, you could say, right? These just as much belong to the self, or the self is their actuality. If they're going to have any actuality, any Wirklichkeit, it's going to be because the self gives that to them. So then he goes on and he says, in accordance with this moment, so we're learning something here, it therefore comes to pass that just as evil is nothing other than the self-centeredness of the natural existence of spirit. Okay, let's pause there for a moment. The self-centeredness of natural existence, we've had plenty of references to that, plenty of discussion of that, particularly in the morality section, in Spirit a lot earlier, right? The natural existence, the natural being of a being often contradicts its moral aspirations, its, acclaimed values or its status or something like that. In this case, the natural existence of spirit. What is the natural existence of spirit? How spirit is in human beings who follow their natural inclinations and desires, to use a rather Kantian formulation. And the self-centeredness. Now, this is really quite a good translation, even though it's not a literal translation. In sich gehen was referenced in earlier paragraphs as something that consciousness is doing, or things are doing, right? Objects of consciousness. They have an in sich gehen, which is different than an sich sein, right? Gehen is to go into yourself, to retreat, to hole yourself up, you could say, or to explore. Self-centeredness is not a very good literal translation of that, but the way that Hegel in general is going to conceive of evil, and the way that many other people do as well, evil is what winds up being too self-centered, not too narrow of a self-identification and its interests and pursuits, and valuing the self above everybody else. Okay, so that that kind of works for a concept of evil, a notion of evil, giving it a name. So because of this, do we find out what good is? No. Instead, we're told that good, almost as a response, almost because evil exists like this, good enters into actuality. Wirklichkeit, the actuality that we were just talking about a moment ago, enters into, Eintritt, steps into actuality. And then this is interesting, and appears as an existent self-consciousness. So, I mean, evil is a self-consciousness, isn't it? Or the evil self-consciousness who's selfish, too self-centered. Good enters into actuality as an existent self-consciousness, a self-consciousness, let's read between the lines, that is taking a stance that's different than that of evil. Maybe, we could say looking to the interests of more than one person, caring about the group, thinking about something bigger than itself, identifying the self with that as part of its actuality, as opposed to the evil, which says, screw the bigger picture, I'm in it for me, right? And so he says, good enters into this, and this is, continuing this antithesis. So he says, that which in the pure thought of spirit is in general merely hinted as the othering of the divine being, again, discussed in the previous paragraphs, right? Here comes nearer to its realization. And here Hegel doesn't use what word we might normally expect in terms of realization, right? Like, Wirklichkeit or Wirklichung or something like that, or even fulfillment, right? Vollendigkeit. No, it's Realisierung, the Latin, it's becoming real, which doesn't mean becoming real in the same way as becoming actual, but becoming real for something, for picture thinking. And he says this realization consists for picture thinking in, and he mentions three things here that are connected with each other. The self-abasement of the divine being, right, the lowering, literally, of the divine being who renounces his abstract and non-actual nature. God becomes one of us. God enters into relation with us. Picture thinking takes the other aspect, evil, to be a happening alien to the divine being. So, if we want to take this very explicitly, we could talk about Christ, right? Christ becomes incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, the Word becomes the man-God, and suffers, dies, is tortured, crucified, all these things. Those are evil that's being done to Christ, being done to God who has lowered himself into our plane. And yet, this isn't all evil. It's not like, well, God's like super good then, and so wonderful, and, takes on our sufferings and sins and knows it. Well, that's all true. But we also have a third thing going on here. To grasp it, to grasp what? Evil in the divine being as the wrath of God. This is also part of not just the Christian heritage, and not just the Jewish matrix that it comes out of, influenced, of course, by Zoroastrianism, bringing in all sorts of other elements. It's not just found in other religions where the gods can be angry or punish human beings. This is kind of a constant, right? And this is a real problem for a theology that has, God is the God of love. God would never be mean to anybody. Well, what about the wrath of God? I mean, this posed such a interesting problem for early Christians that Lactantius writes an entire treatise about this, engaging with not just, religious concepts, but also the philosophical literature of his time about anger, some very sophisticated engagement of thinking with this issue of the wrath, the ira, the anger of God. So, how do we bring these together? Well, from the perspective of picture thinking, We can't. We're stuck oscillating between things. And it sounds not only as if evil now is within human beings, it sounds as if evil could even be within the divine, right? And so that is going to cause a lot of problems. So he says picture thinking takes this other aspect to be happening just to the divine being, trying to grasp it as the wrath of God. This demands from picture thinking its supreme and most strenuous effort, but that effort remains fruitless. Why? Because picture thinking is a little bit too, even though it's very sophisticated, it's still a little bit too rigid. It's still a little bit too given to taking differences or distinctions as if they are once and for all and, apply. It's corresponding to what I've called, following Hegel in his lectures on the philosophy of religion, the philosophies of the understanding, not a philosophy or religious comportment of the notion or concept. The alienation of the divine being is thus made explicit in its twofold form. The self of spirit and its simple thought are the two moments whose absolute unity is spirit itself. Its alienation consists in the moments going apart from one another and in one of them having an unequal value compared with the other. This disparity is therefore twofold, and two relationships arise whose common moments are just those given. In one of them, the divine being counts as essence, while natural existence and the self count as the unessential aspect which is to be superseded. In the other, on the contrary, being for self counts as the essential and the simple divine being as unessential. Their still empty middle term is existence in general, the bare community of their two moments. Paragraph 778 is following up now, talking about the divine being, which was being brought up at the end of the previous paragraph, talking about how through picture thinking or representation, Vorstellung, rather than the concept, we're not really able to reconcile, to work through the not only contradiction but conflict, Kampf, in the previous paragraph, between two sides. And we see this continued on here, now talked about in terms of alienation and Fremdung, so the rich vocabulary of opposition going on here. But there's an interesting development that's taking place as well, which we could read a lot into, but perhaps we won't do quite so much of as we did in the previous paragraph. So he says, the alienation of the divine being. What's the alienation we're talking about here? The alienation due to trying to understand evil in terms of the divine being. Evil is something that happens to the divine being, become incarnate, but also as the wrath of God. He's not going to talk about these terms here, but he says this alienation of the divine being is made explicit in its twofold form. So we've got two things that are opposed to each other. The self of spirit, das Selbst des Geistes. So this is going to be kind of important to bring up this terminology. And then on the other side, we have, it's translated as, well enough, its simple thought, right? Gedanke is thought here. And Einfacher, it's sein. What's the sein referring to? What's the it's referring to? The self of spirit. So you've got the self of spirit, which is not alienated in relation to something totally different than itself, but it's alienated in relation to its own simple thought. And you can say, well, this is part of what happens when you have self-conscious subjects, self-conscious selves. And he tells us that these are two moments whose absolute unity, absolute, Einfachheit, right, is spirit itself. And now notice the play on words here, right? Geist selbst, das Selbst des Geists, right? Spirit itself, the self of spirit, is all in this unity, but that alienation is there. It's not just a illusion to be, overcome so we can grasp spirit itself in an undifferentiated unity or something like that. No, we want the concept. and that's yet to come. So he tells us that this alienation consists in, and here we get another doubling, you could say. The moments going apart from each other, auseinandertreten. Now, this is something we should think about. How do they literally step outside of each other? How do they take a step, ein Tritt, right, outside of each other? Well, there's this process that's happening within the self of spirit, right, and thereby within spirit itself, where the Geist selbst is differentiated into these two that can be alienated from each other, and they step apart from each other. They go apart from each other, thereby becoming something that can be not only grasped by consciousness, but ways in which consciousness is grasping. Even more important, one of them having unequal value compared with the other. Value is Wert, right? A value in the very broad sense. And both of them can have unequal value compared to the other, as we find out. Because as Hegel's going to go on in this section, he says, this disparity, this Ungleichheit, unequalness, right? And Ungleichheit is a reference to having unequal value, unequal Werte in comparison to each other. They are perhaps incommensurable, or each of them represents themselves as being greater or lesser than the other. They mistake their genuine relatedness value, and they set themselves up as independent from each other in this way. So part of the going apart from each other is like conceptualizing, actually not conceptually, representing these unequal values, right? So the disparity is, here the translation is twofold, literally is the twofold, right? Ist darum die gedoppelte, the doubled, the thing that is being doubled, this disparity. So the unequalness, the not lining up with each other, is itself what is doubled in this process. So we not only have doubling here, we not only have a double process here, this disparity itself is going to be doubled, and he goes on to say, two relationships arise whose common elements are those just given, or common moments, right? What are the common moments? Self of spirit, it's simple thought. In one of them, in one of these relationships, the divine being counts as essence, while natural existence and the self count as the unessential aspect, which is to be superseded. So the divine being is what really matters. Natural existence, the self, unessential, have to be canceled, have to be aufgehoben, have to be raised up, have to be transformed in some way. So that's one way in which these can relate to each other. And the other way is what? Being for self counts as the essential, and the simple divine being as unessential. Which one corresponds to which? Well, I think it's pretty tempting to read this as its simple thought is the abstract grasp of the divine being. So in that case, divine being counts as essence, natural existence and the self count as the unessential. The self of spirit would be the natural existence of it, brought up in the previous paragraph. And then being for self would be essential, the simple divine being unessential. And now notice, remember in the last paragraph we had a contradiction that was unresolved, right? Unreconciled, unworked through. Why? Because we're dealing with representation, not yet the concept. And Hegel gives us here a still empty middle term, existence in general, the bare community of their two moments, right? So it's not the same thing as the alienation. It's not, it could be the absolute unity, but the absolute unity is conceived of as kind of just meh, blah, right? Just what it is. We're not getting there yet, but we're now on our way.